We are officially live. So, good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Abhinav Agarwal, and welcome to this latest edition of the Indic Club Swarajya Magazine Q&A with authors. And today, I'm delighted to have David Frawley, who is now known as Pandit Vamdev Shastri. So, good morning, and a big, bright welcome to David Frawley. And I'm going to refer to you as Vamdev ji from now on.
Good morning. Actually, it's good evening here. I'm very happy to be with you and to share in your wonderful series of webinars, dialogues, and teachings that are happening on so many different levels.
Thank you. So, for those of you who don't know, Pandit Vamdev Shastri was born in 1950, and he has been an American Hindu teacher and an American Hindu for at least 35 years now. He was influenced greatly by Sri Aurobindo's writings and during his visits to India. He is a recipient of the Padma Bhushan in 2015 and was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India last year. And he has been writing for more than almost more than 30 years, and has more than 30 books to his credit on topics such as the Vedas, on Hindu mythology, Ayurveda, Vedic astrology, Vedic astronomy, and also on the Aryan invasion theory, or the myth, as might be a better word to describe it as. So with respect to, I would like to call out two of his books that talk about the Aryan invasion theory. The first one, The Myth of the Aryan Invasion of India, and in the second one, where he co-authored the book with George Feuerstein and Professor Subhash Kak, In Search of the Cradle of Civilization. You are fairly critical of the racial basis on which the Aryan invasion theory has been formulated over the past several decades, and where it's been theorized by some that the Aryans came in from somewhere in Central Europe and invaded and conquered northern India, and then moved to the rest of India, displacing the native so-called Aboriginal Indians down further south and out of the Indus Valley. I have a few questions related to that, but let me start out with the first one, which is that your book came out almost 25 years ago in 1991. And first of all, can you tell us, when you wrote that book, what was your thinking at the time in selecting a book on the Vedas? And it is a fairly detailed book. You quote extensively from the Vedas, and how did you go about writing it? And were you interested, apprehensive about the reaction you thought that this book would receive coming from an American and a Hindu in the West as well as in India?
Yes, well, let me just put it into a little bit of perspective here. I studied yoga and Vedanta starting in the late 60s, and then through Sri Aurobindo became introduced into the work of the Vedas. Something inspired me to look at the Vedas in the original Sanskrit, and mainly for the spiritual and yogic meaning of the text, which I studied in detail. I began translating a number of the Vedic hymns. But in doing so, I found that the historical and cultural perspective I've discovered studying the Vedas in the original Sanskrit was very different than what the history books had presented. So after a number of years, extending more than a decade of translating Vedic hymns, I decided to do a book on the historical aspects because I saw so much discrepancy there. And actually, this book was originally written for an American audience and only later published in India. And it was done as a part of a spiritual quest. And I was surprised at the reaction to it and the positive response to it, not only in India, but also in the West. And I suddenly found myself involved in a whole set of questions and controversies that I had not entirely planned to be part of, but I felt I was equipped to deal with. And over time, I did added more and more to that. And you'll see in that book of 25 years ago, we're examining or raising the same issues that are being examined and raised in India today relative to these same issues. So on one hand, I'm happy that the book is still relevant after 25 years. On the other hand, it's also interesting to see that these basic questions are still there, not resolved, even though the evidence is much more in our favor.
So true. One would have thought, and you do write in your book that, and this is, I'm talking about 1991, that emerging evidence suggests that this should be called more an Indus-Saraswati civilization rather than strictly an Indus civilization. And it is somewhat curious and also sad that 25 years later we are still having that discussion. So now I alluded to the Aryan theory, when introducing your books, and the fact is that today, 25 years after you first wrote your book, the Aryan theory today is a lot more discredited than it was in 1991. But for a variety of reasons, this racial attribution, it remains starkly persistent with not only Western academia, but also in India with the leftist and Marxist, historians. They have stubbornly refused to adapt, modify, or discard this theory. So in your opinion and in your studies over the last several decades, what would you attribute this persistence of this theory, for which, frankly speaking, in 100 years, not a shred or iota of credible evidence has been presented forward, coming in from an American perspective? What would what's your take on that?
Well, first, you're absolutely right. There's no hard evidence for the theory at all. There's nothing archaeologically in terms of ruins. There's nothing in terms of geography. There's nothing in the text. There's nothing in genetics. There's only speculation. But the fact that this theory continues is easy to understand. It is not just a question of India, but of European identity. The Germans invested a lot in Aryan nationalism in the 19th century. And even though the Nazi side of it has been discredited, it still continues. Russians have it, Ukrainians have it. Europeans in general are looking for, in the Aryans, the original Europeans. So it's very difficult for them to give up that idea of their own heritage. And for that purpose, they have ignored what the Vedas actually say and made the archaeology of India irrelevant to their own ideas. Besides that, there's been massive political investment in the theory. Marx turned the caste theory and the Aryan invasion theory into his class war for India, which the Marxists have turned into an article of faith. The Aryan theory became the basis of Dravidian nationalism, which also is not found in any ancient or even medieval Dravidian text. It's only found in modern times after Western scholars encouraged the Dravidian nationalist movement. Even the Dalit movement, the idea that the Dalits were the original Aryans, or the original indigenous people displaced by the Aryans, has a lot of political investment. So there's no ancient theory in the history of the world that has had such political investment, cultural investment on the other side. And of course, on the Hindu side, that also exists, because on the Hindu side, that is Hindu identity and history and the history of India. So that is why this idea of what happened 3,000 to 5,000 years ago in India is still a very major political concern here, where in no other country of the world are events of ancient history invested with such problematical issues.
So, what is also interesting is, and I believe someone else recently has talked about it, and certainly Arun Shourie, for example, also has written about it, is that if you look at communist, the history written by historians in hardcore communist nations such as the Soviet Union, they are a lot more honest and frank about about some of the historical aspects of India, rather than our own Indian historians, who have been more loyal than the Queen, so to say, when it has come to defending and perpetuating these theories. Would you like to share your thoughts on that part?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, the Russians have rewritten their history in the post-Marxist era and thrown out all these Marxist interpretations of history. The Chinese are also bringing in Confucius and recognizing their own history more. It's only in India where we find the colonial history still there. Even in America, we've thrown out the history of the Native Americans, who were also marginalized historically by the Western historians, and rewritten that. So it's odd that only India is keeping up this colonial view because it has political value for certain groups in India today. And there's an attempt to avoid the data rather than to bring it in. And as the Aryan question is disproved, for example, as we see, there's no evidence of Aryans coming into the country, there's no evidence of invasion or destruction, there's no Aryan artifacts, no Aryan ruins, nothing that can be attributed to the Aryan invasion or even migration. Then this theory has been rewritten to say, well, the migrants were smaller in number, they didn't need to leave an historical record, they could have done all this work and change in the culture without ever anybody knowing who they were or where they came from. So this is not evidence, this is clouding over the theory. Or as our friend Kalyanaraman says, it's become the Aryan invasion, migration, tourist trickle-down theory, so that the Aryans no longer need to be identified in any way, they just can be maintained according to the vested interest of those who are holding to the theories.
Thank you. This is perfect. So let me move to the next question, which is that, so, it's sort of related to the previous question, which is that in your book, coming to, to your book that we are talking about, Gods, Sages, and Kings, Vedic Secrets of Ancient Civilization, you write that most central to the historical interpretation of the Rig Veda is the story of Sudas and the legendary battle of the 10 kings. And later you also write that some modern scholars have seen in the story of Sudas the Aryan conquest of India and its aboriginal peoples. So can you elaborate on this, a little bit on this point for our viewers, and why this is not necessarily the case? And you do describe and elaborate in your book to this point, where you basically say that both the victor and the defeated were Aryans. So can you share your thoughts on that?
Yes, but just to put the book in a little bit of perspective, the book starts with the image of the ocean and the fact that there's more than 150 references to the ocean in the Rig Veda itself, including ships crossing the sea, Shataritra, or 100 oars. So I've placed the Vedic culture firmly in India all the way down to the sea. Now, when we come to the Aryan Dasyu or Arya Dasyu Dasa conflicts that we see in the Vedic text, there's the tendency to interpret them by the Aryan invasionist, migrationist as a battle with indigenous people. But if we read the text, we find that terms like Dasa or Dasyu can be given to the same peoples, Vedic peoples, according to their behavior. And in that regard, the Vedic people are divided largely into 5 groups: the Turvashas, Yadus, Purus, Anus, and Druyus. And of these, the Vedic people per se are the Puru Bharatas primarily. And so they were in conflict with some of the local people. Particularly Turvashas and Yadus are mentioned as Dasas, Dasyus, and inimical people. But specifically in the 10 Kings battle and hymn and verses, the enemies are specifically said to be Anus, Druyus, and Turvashas, and possibly some Purus. So they are clearly members of the same 5 groups of broader Vedic people. Arya is not an indication of race or ethnicity, but of behavior and culture. So too with Dasa. Generally, Arya is the more noble aspect of the culture. Dasa is more the common or sometimes the debased aspect of the culture. We see this later in Mahabharata, where the Pandavas and the Kauravas were fighting each other in a civil war. And even there, the terms Asura and Mlecha are used for Sindhus and Sauviras, or people of Punjab and Western India. These negative terms are behavioral and should not be interpreted in an ethnic matter. Also, this battle is said to occur between 2 rivers, the Parushni, which is the Ravi, and the Yamuna on the other side. And clearly what is in between Parushni and Yamuna is the Saraswati River. Sudas, the main king, was attacked from the east and the west So clearly he was located in the Saraswati region, fighting local inimical people or nearby people regarded as part of the same greater culture of the five peoples.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll move to the next question, which is that, and that you write in your book, I think on page 227, that it is in the worship of the goddesses in India that the forms of the Vedic religion most survive today. The Vedic ideas of the spiritual life as a sacrifice, a battle, and a chant are most found in the goddess worship. Now, while today, based on evidence, we know that there is no discontinuity between the Vedic age and the so-called Brahmanical age that came much later, according to some historians. What you write about, which is that the worship of the goddesses in India is where forms of the Vedic religion from almost 4,000-5,000 years or back survive today. It is still startling to many that there's such a high degree of continuity, and that too in the form of the worship of the goddess. What can you please elaborate on that?
Yes, well, first of all, the Vedic teaching, like the Puranic teaching and the later Hindu teachings, is highly pluralistic, synthetic, has a number of deities and a number of points of view. The main difference that we find in Vedic times is the image of the deities is more naturalistic. Agni as fire, Surya as the sun, rather than anthropomorphic or human in images like the later deities we find in the Puranic tradition. So they're only vaguely anthropomorphic, so to call them simply male or female is incorrect, or to regard them as representing male or female values. They're more a vision of the world of nature. So that is the first point. We shouldn't just read male and female images into Vedic deities. Agni is referred to in some instances as a child, Indra as a young man, but all the Vedic deities are said in a number of the hymns that they're honored like the father and the mother, the brother and the sister, and connected to all aspects of life and all aspects of nature are definitely there. And in that respect, the feminine side is also there. All the Vedic deities have their consorts or feminine sides. And most specifically, Veda itself is Veda Mata, or Veda as the mother. And Veda is the manifestation of Vak, which is the feminine principle, speech, the word. The mantra is the feminine principle. Even more so, the chandas or the meter of the Vedic hymns is the feminine principle. And there are also feminine deities and feminine images woven throughout the Vedas. Scholars tend to interpret a hymn superficially by the name of the deity the main hymn is given to, like Indra, who has often very masculine characteristics. But he's also sometimes said to be dearer than the mother, and that the mother is the most dear, and Indra is like our dearest mother. So the feminine images are also there in the background. There is a continuity of Vedic and Tantric teachings relative to the use of mantra, sacred nature of the Sanskrit alphabet, and the worship of Shakti. Vedic deities have more the form of light, Jyotirmaya Purusha. In the Shakta tradition, it's more the form of lightning. But the Shakti and the light and the lightning always go together, the Shiva Shakti influences. So there is a certain feminine Shakti Devi dimension of Vedic thought and Vedic teachings that should be recognized and hasn't been given it. That the Vedas emphasize nature and are not so anthropomorphic in their imagery.
Okay, excellent. Move to the next question, which is now one point that you obviously raise is that a large part of the Vedic civilization flourished along the Saraswati River. The other point that you raise is that the Vedas strongly suggest that the Vedic civilization that flourished along this Saraswati River was a maritime civilization, and you write that not only is Indra compared to the sea, his thunderbolt Vajra with which he slays the dragon is found in the ocean is one of the verses from the Vedas. And so it's more now, my question is more historical in nature, which is that why then have India's maritime advances and its long history of maritime trade been relegated in history texts, not only in India but even in foreign texts that talk and write about India. Even the Cholas, for example, who ruled over the oceans 1,000 years ago in the Indian, or near the Indian subcontinent, are mentioned but in passing.
Yes. Very important point. The largest Hindu empire historically is Srivijaya, which extended throughout all of South India, all the way through Indonesia, even I think touching the Philippines, at least until as far as its influence goes. There's been a long history of maritime contact, of course, the spice trade going to Kerala from China, from Rome, from Babylonia, and all those cultures has definitely been there and has been ignored, even though it flourished all the way up until the 16th century, before when Indonesia became dominantly Muslim. We also find in Sri Lanka as early as the 6th century BCE, Sanskrit and Arya culture there. Could be much earlier than that. We have that into the 2nd century BCE in Indonesia. So clearly there was a maritime aspect to the ancient Indian culture. And the Vedic aspect of that is ignored the most, even though the Vedas talk about Saraswati peering its course from the mountains to the sea and have the image of the ocean. And we know that Gujarat and Kutch was an important part of the Harappan civilization, which also was maritime in its activity. And the Vedic rishis are connected to the sea, the Brigus to Kutch. Manu is a flood figure connected to Kerala or the Malaya region. All the Vedic deities are connected to the sea. Indra releases the 7 rivers to flow into the sea. Agni has his oceanic form, Samudra Vasasam. Soma is lauded as the great ocean, Mahasamudra. Varuna is specifically a deity of the sea and the ocean. The idea of crossing great rivers and oceans is there throughout the Vedic text. Great Vedic rishis, Brigu families, we say, is also descendants of the god Varuna. And even Vasishta and Agastya are connected to Mitra and Varuna as their progenitors and deities. And in the Vedic text, Vasishta, who has the largest number of hymns, is connected to the ocean directly and placed upon as a ship upon the sea. And he's said to be the younger brother of Agastya, who is well known to be connected to the sea. So these symbols and connections are there all along, going back to the oldest Vedic text, and we should not ignore them.
Thank you, Vamdevji. I have a follow-on question to that of sorts, which is that now, one of, when talking about this topic is more about the Saraswati River, which is that in some cases, the reference to, the Saraswati River as a mighty ocean, some people might have argued that this is not the Saraswati River that they were referring to because, as you write, the Saraswati River of today is but a small stream found in Haryana. But, again, 3,000 or 3,500 years ago, the Saraswati was a mighty river. What is, in your opinion, the basis of this confusion of, the Saraswati is not the mighty ocean-like river that is referred to, but might be some other reference?
Well, first of all, the Saraswati dried up around 4,000 years ago. So anybody who wants to maintain the Aryan invasion theory of 1500 BC has to discredit or ignore the Saraswati River. We also know the Saraswati River didn't dry up all at once. It went through what is called the Vinashana phase, where it dried up into a series of lakes in the Haryana region. And we find the Vinashana Saraswati mentioned in a lot of the very late Vedic literature, like Mahabharata, and even I think maybe suggested in some of the later Brahmanas. So it's very interesting that we have in the Vedic literature the stages of the drying up of the Saraswati River, with in the oldest hymns having Saraswati as a mighty river flowing into the sea, and only in later hymns the Vinashana. And apparently this Vinashana, or period in which the Saraswati dried up in a series of lakes, corresponds with the Harappan, or at least the late Harappan era. And by the end of the Harappan era, even that phase of the river apparently is gone. There has been wonderful work on the river by the Geological Survey of India that you can examine for more detail on this issue. There are still some issues of the timing of the different phases of the river, but it does appear that the Vedas represent the pre-Harappan phase of the Saraswati River, and the later Vedic period is more likely extending into Mahabharata, the Harappan phase and beyond.
Great. So my next question is somewhat connected to the question I asked, about goddesses. And you did say that, it's easy to anthropomorphize some of the, the shlokas, the verses in the Mahabharata. But it has become, my question is that it has become somewhat fashionable over the, past few years for, I use the word pop experts in Hinduism to proclaim that ancient Hindu civilization was patriarchal and somewhat discriminatory towards women by nature. And you, on the other hand, quote several, verses, shlokas from the Vedas. So one of them is that the seers or the sages often compared themselves to women or wives of gods. You write that women could go to assemblies and choose their husbands, and there is no mention of sati or widow burning to be found in the Vedas. And while, of course, we all realize that every culture undergoes a process of transformation. It changes. Hindu culture, Vedic culture has never been static, which even the Vedas, as from the start to the latter parts of the Vedas brings out very clearly. But why this dogmatic insistence, on the part of modern experts to label Hindu culture as patriarchal, ipso facto, discriminatory against women?
Well, there's a broader question here, and that is we cannot use 21st century standards of political correctness to judge ancient cultures. And if we're going to do that to judge ancient Hinduism, we have to judge all the other ancient cultures of the world and even modern cultures of the world. Women were not treated very well in England in the 19th century. Slavery was still there throughout 19th century Europe and the United States. So if we take a book like Manu Samhita, it may not correspond terribly well according to certain modern political standards, but as something 2,000 to 3,000 years old, it stands very well relative to other law books and law codes according to the times. If we're going to judge Hinduism by the Manu Samhita, we ought to judge Christianity by the law codes of Charlemagne. And we also have to understand that in Hinduism, there is no Sharia. The dharmic codes, the law codes, are books of certain cultures at certain times. They are not scriptures for all of time. And Hindus are allowed to make changes culturally, socially in their behavior relative to changes in time. We have to look at ancient times in the context. There was not technology. There were not printing press. People did not live so long. There were often foreign invasions where women had to be protected. So male and female roles had to be more clearly defined than they are today. So first of all, let's remove that historical disconnect. And what we do see if we study the text is that there was profound respect for the feminine as a spiritual principle. India has the greatest set of worship of the goddess you'll find anywhere in the world. In Christianity, Mary is the mother of God. She is not the divine mother or the mother of the universe. She is only the mother of Jesus. Even in the Buddhist tradition, Tara is a bodhisattva, a being who lived once and took a vow to save living beings. She is not the mother of the universe. So this worship of the mother of the universe is what we find most in the Hindu text, also in some of the other pagan and traditional texts, and in great detail going back to the ancient text and rooted in that. For example, when we do the worship of Durga, Durga Sukta consists of entirely Vedic verses, particularly for the worship of Agni, and Durga also arises from Agni, or the sacred fire. So we have to look at a deeper level of the teachings, and at an appropriate historical perspective, with consideration for the times. And the fact is that we do need to liberalize culture in various ways relative to women and other social classes and things. But in ancient times, medieval times, they had other compulsions they needed to attend to that we should not forget. And we should look into the deeper meaning rather than create unnecessary political controversies.
I have somewhat of a provocative question to ask here, and I won't dwell deep or much into this, but I'd still like to ask you that according to at least one very, very prominent expert on Hinduism, and the lady is based in the US, is her proposition is that the more the respect given to women or the more the worship of the feminine form in Hinduism, it's actually an indicator of the extent of discrimination and violence against women. What are your thoughts on that? I hadn't planned on asking this question, but I'll still go ahead.
Well, first of all, again, a broader issue. The ancient texts are not concerned, and even the medieval, the Hindu texts are not concerned with political and social matters. They're concerned with worship of the divine. Worship of the divine as the infinite, the eternal, the transcendent. Shakti as the mother of the universe, but also Chit Shakti, the supreme consciousness that transcends the universe. She is honored as the self of all beings, as the divine presence in all beings. And a lot of the images of Shakti worship are images of sadhana, the chakras, kundalini, overcoming the negative thoughts, the demonic energies within our own minds. So when we politicize what are essentially mystical symbols, we can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of problems definitely to occur. So it's very important that we understand where these teachings are coming from. But the fact is that you find the worship of the goddess throughout India, the great temples, the great festivals, and these have, to a very great extent, helped with the honoring of the feminine principle and helped with the honoring of the goddess. Now, certainly there are social issues you can address in Hindu and other society over time, whether it's slavery, whether it's issues of women, but targeting Hinduism as a religion is completely inappropriate. It'd be much more appropriate to target Christianity or Islam for the social inequalities that existed between male and female in those cultures. But even more importantly, spiritual texts should be looked at directly and social issues should be looked at directly. This issue is to try to discredit Hindu spirituality because of the social situation in medieval India is highly politically motivated and is actually missing the meaning of the text. And we see how the world is embracing these spiritual texts and teachings from the Hindu tradition. And we should learn to honor that, and India should learn to honor that, and Western scholars should too.
Okay, I have one question that came in from chat, and I'll open this webinar to our attendees in just a minute. But I'd like to put this question forward before moving to the next one, which is that, and I'll read out the question, which is that I would like to ask Pandit Vamdev Shastri on classification of Indian religions vis-a-vis Abrahamic. Should we say Abrahamic religions are belief systems and Indic ones are philosophic systems? Would it be, I think the question is, would it be accurate or fair to characterize the two as such?
Well, between Abrahamic traditions and Indic traditions or Dharmic traditions, I would say the Abrahamic traditions are faith-based traditions primarily, and they're also rooted in historical revelations. Vedic traditions are dharmic and knowledge-based. Veda means knowledge. It does not mean faith. Faith has a certain place. We need some faith or confidence to pursue knowledge, but knowledge is the goal. The rishi is honored as a person or a seer, not as a man of faith. And there is no specific belief system in the Vedic and the Dharmic traditions. Dharmic traditions teach us a way of meditation so that we can experience the truth directly for ourselves. So I would say faith-based traditions versus knowledge-based traditions, but there's naturally a degree of crossover between the two. There are some knowledge-based aspect to faith-based traditions and faith-based aspects to knowledge-based traditions. But the Indic traditions are meditation-based, not belief-based. They do not have any salvation by proxy or any salvation at all. What is aimed at is spiritual realization, self-knowledge, and higher awareness, defined as various ways transcending the mind to a state of consciousness of the universal reality.
Okay. Thank you, Vamdev. My last question before I open this up for Q&A is that what is your current focus of work and research, and what can we expect from you in 2016 and even beyond?
Well, actually, what we just brought out, which is very relevant, came out at the end of 2014, is the new book called The Vedic Yoga, The Path of the Rishi, which has over 400 translations in terms of verses from the Rig Veda, and tries to show how yoga, meditation, mantra, aspects of Ayurveda, Hindu spirituality can be found in the hymns and mantras of the Rig Veda itself, and drawing continuity from Upanishadic references that we find to Rig Veda, like Vamadeva's reference that I am the sun, Aham Manurabhavam Suryascha, which was given relative to the Aham Brahmasmi, the I am Brahman statement of that Upanishad, to show that there's a continuity of the spiritual yogic tradition going back to the earliest times. Vedas are not just an historical tradition, but a great cultural tradition. Then after that, we're releasing shortly a book called Shiva, the Lord of Yoga. The American edition is out, Indian edition is coming shortly, where we discuss the connections of Shiva with the Vedas and Vedic Shaivism, and the antiquity of yoga and Shaivism, and also its relevance not only relative to India, but this whole worship throughout the ancient world, the standing stones, the worship of the sacred fire, which extends far beyond India. So that work is going on, and we have other books since on the history that has occurred, and more research also on the spiritual practices of the Vedas and the meditation practices. I'm doing some more research on that right now.
Thank you, Vamdevji. I am now going to open this up to our attendees to ask questions. So please note that your microphones, I have muted your microphones. So if you want to ask a question, please unmute your microphone and you can ask your question. If you want, you can also send your question in by chat, and I will read those out after this.
Vamdevji, my name is Harish. I'm actually from Baltimore, Maryland. So I have this question for you. When you look at most of the academic institutions in India, it is almost taken over by leftist Marxist historians. So how do you think someone should approach this and try to establish Indian history from a viewpoint of a history rather than from a political situation where you try to interpret everything as elitist who try to win over and who try to suppress a large majority, because that is the way people interpret, and sometimes they even come out proudly and say that I'm a Marxist historian. So what are the ways forward? Should we just try to make our own institutions, or is it time for digital universities? How do we streamline this whole process in trying to replace the narrative?
Well, first of all, the old narrative has to be challenged. We are living in the post-Marxist era, except in perhaps Indian academia. As we said, the academics throughout the world have thrown out most of the Marxism, particularly, we say, even in the Soviet Union. Their views should be challenged, and they are. ICHR is definitely challenging them right now. And their views should be challenged. And we also should highlight their political background that is relevant. And the fact is that their theories are also true to their political views. We do need to create our own institutions as well. And we do need to bring more Hindus and also more just open-minded people into historical studies. Even in America, Freudian psychology is only being used to interpret the Hindu religion. It has been thrown out relative to Christianity and other religions. Freud himself used his own psychology to discredit his own religion and called Moses himself a historical fraud. Yet no one in Jewish study uses that today. So we need to expose how these theories are outdated and wrong. But we should also recognize that these people, their influence is mainly in academia. For example, in America, nobody knows who Wendy Doniger is or Michael Witzel. You will find they're almost totally unknown entities, and you'll find their books are hardly read. But a book like Autobiography of a Yogi is read by millions of people. He's against the Aryan invasion, also Paramahansa Yogananda. And even a movie was made of his life, and there are many millions of people practicing yoga, meditation, taking up the spiritual aspect of these teachings, and not influenced by that historical narrative or following a different historical narrative, such as we find in the Vedic and the older traditions throughout the world. So we need to challenge them, definitely. We need new books, new teachings, but we need to understand the breadth of what is going on. And we need both our own institutions, but we also need to move into the academic realm. Unfortunately, Hindus didn't do that. Sikhs have done it. And if we follow their example, we see that that can also be changed. It is a political and educational matter, not entirely a matter of historical studies.
Okay, thank you, Ramdevji. I have two questions that have come in through chat. One is, the first one is that this is regarding the study or the revival of Ayurveda. And the question is the study of Ayurveda sufficient to revive it? What are the other activities that need to be undertaken for its strong revival, or what would you do you have any strong opinions or thoughts one way or the other on it?
Yes, that's a very important topic. It's slightly different than the topic of the webinar, but I've been involved in the Ayurvedic field. When we started about over 30 years ago, no one in the West knew what Ayurveda was, and in India there was no respect for it. In 30 years, we have seen a very major change. Almost all the gurus in from India now have Ayurvedic products. Ramdev and Balakrishna are spreading the message of Ayurveda throughout the country. There are Ayurvedic groups throughout most of the yoga centers of the world. And Ayurveda has many, many books and bestsellers, as for my friend Deepak Chopra, for example. So it has come very far in 30 years. It hasn't had enough government support. It has only slowly given that. Now, today, Ayush has its independent ministry, which was previously under the medical establishment. But Ayurveda is coming forth. It needs more support, more study. More people in India should practice pure Ayurveda with the license they have today. They can also practice the modern medicine, and some choose to do that. So more emphasis needs to be brought into Ayurveda, because natural healing, meditation, awareness, behavioral medicine, right lifestyle, all these vegetarianism, all these things are very important parts of a healthier medicine and way of life globally. China supported its traditional medical heritage, even though it wasn't, even when it was a communist country. So even the left in India should support Ayurveda. This is something for the benefit of everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll go to the next question, which has come in through chat, which is, so it's got two parts. The first is that, yes, this session is being recorded, and after the webinar, I will put both an audio version of this webinar on SoundCloud and a video version on YouTube. So yes, so this is going to be made available, over the web. And the second is part of this question is how to contact you. This person says that I have great interest in this subject and currently doing my own little research into Vedas, Indus Valley civilization, and the epics. Would it be possible to mail you? And I think you are somewhat active on Twitter. So would you mind sharing a Twitter handle? That might be one good way for people to reach out to you.
Yes, we do have a very large website at vedanet.com, vedanet.com. There's more than 100 original articles on various aspects of Vedic thought that I have posted there, and many other resources, links to all the books and publications and courses. Twitter, the handle is just David Frawley Ved, V-E-D, and I've been active on that. We also have a Dr. David Frawley Facebook page where we keep up with all of our various activities. As we are active in a number of fields like Ayurveda, Jyotish, Yoga, and Vedic studies, you will find at times different topics there, but more towards the Indian audience. I have been using Twitter specifically for that purpose. It works very well.
Thank you. I'll move to the next question again from chat, which is, the question is that you have studied Vedas from a spiritual, historical, social, and cultural perspective. And is there somebody who has looked into it from science and engineering perspectives and redefine the basis of management sciences, including economics and policy? And the person says, I have an engineering background and would be interested.
Yes, there are many other people working in the Vedic field. In the science and engineering field, my friend Subhash Kak, who you will have, I think, on a future webinar, can handle that very well. For those interested in the archaeology, there's Professor B.B. Lal, the former director of the Archaeological Survey of India, who has put forth that information in very good books like The Saraswati Flows On, that you can examine. We've also mentioned the Geological Survey of India. There are groups bringing out aspects of Vedic study relative to economics. I've dealt with the Ayurvedic, the Jyotish, and the spiritual issue. We also have a book on Vedic counseling coming up, and we are working on certain management issues. There are groups like the Chinmaya Mission that have addressed that. And there are many other important authors. Sri Aurobindo has very important works on the Vedas, and there's this whole school coming out of him. Ramana Maharshi's disciple, Kavyakanta Ganapati Muni, I've mentioned that in my Vedic yoga book, Swami Veda Bharati. Sri Anirvan, the whole Arya Samaj tradition, there's quite a bit there. In the Hindu tradition and the spiritual tradition, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that the academics are ignoring, but is quite relevant as to the yogic and spiritual and even historical meaning of the Vedic text and scientific connections.
Okay. While I do have a few more questions we have a very active chat session going on, but I'd like to open this up to people who if they want to ask questions directly, please do so. If not, then I will continue with reading out questions that have come in from the chat window. Okay, let me continue with reading the questions from chat. There are two or three. I'll see how I can. I'll start with the first one, which is that very sort of central, or at least a very much connected with the question of the Vedas is also the question of Sanskrit. And Sri Rajiv Malhotra has recently come out with his latest book, which is Battle for Sanskrit. And I think if I go back, the question is, do you have any thoughts on A, if you have read the book, and B, on the issue of Sanskrit and its origins, because it has been argued by some that Sanskrit itself is foreign in origin to India.
Yes, first of all, I've known Rajiv for probably close to 20 years. I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I did discuss with him at some points the contents and the ideas there. The point I would like to raise in the Vedic context is that all the modern scholars, East and West, and the academics are always saying how great Paninian Sanskrit is, how scientific, how well formed. And then they're saying that, well, Vedic Sanskrit was very primitive, nature worship and nothing more. But the fact is, Vedic Sanskrit is extremely sophisticated, and the sophisticated nature of Paninian Sanskrit is only possible because of Vedic Sanskrit, which Panini refers to and honors in many ways. If we look at the Vedic language and the Vedic Sanskrit, it is filled with multi-leveled meanings, with deep symbolism, with profound plays upon the sounds of words, with subtle adaptability of word meanings, with very complex metrical patterns. with very deep spiritual symbolism. So my point, one of the arguments I have for this, the antiquity and sophistication of the Vedic culture, is Sanskrit, and not only Paninian Sanskrit, but Vedic Sanskrit, and the need to give the Vedic Sanskrit its deeper study and place of honor that we also give to Panini. Vedas are said to be manifestations of Vak, connected to this idea of a cosmic language, a mantric language, a spiritual language, divine word, you can put it in various ways, but more as a scientific factor of vibratory consciousness, even in the Vedic thought. So it's very important that we reclaim the Vedic sophistication of Sanskrit and Vedic Sanskrit, and also recognize that Sanskrit is the ultimate language of deeper consciousness and yogic spirituality, meditation, going all the way back to Vedas.
Thank you so much. And yes, we are, hoping to do in the coming, not too distant future, webinar with Sri Rajiv Malhotra and his book. But I'll move on to the next question, which is that, and I'll read out the question, which is that you were the first one to mention that mantras given in the Upanishads are from the Samhitas. Your point that while they are given philosophical or spiritual meaning for those mantras, but in the Samhitas, they are given as mere rituals. Is this not an issue in Hinduism? The philosophical schools of Hinduism actually not understanding the essence of Samhitas, but trying to make it just as the ritual.
Yes, there are issues there, but we have to recognize, first of all, I'm not the first person who did that. Sri Aurobindo has done that. Even there was this Atmananda commentary on Asyavamasya Sukta, I think from the 12th century. We also find a reference to Vedic verses for spiritual realization in Mahabharata, Puranas, even in some works of Shankara, even most notably in the Upanishads and Brahmanas. Even in Brahmanas, I always say, Ya evam Veda, for he who knows. It is never a question of just ritual. So what happened is we hold that the Vedic mantras can be interpreted as either karma or jnana, as either knowledge or ritual. The later philosophical traditions ignored or did not give adequate importance to the philosophical basis or inner meaning of the Vedic mantras because they were very ancient and very archaic and require a much deeper study. So we can understand why they haven't given them that importance, but now that we've moved into an era where we understand symbolic languages, when we can go into deeper mantras, it is very important that we reclaim that. Another great guru who did Upanishadic commentaries in the Vedic light was Sri Anirvan. And of course, we've mentioned Sri Aurobindo. And my Vedic Yoga book actually covers this topic in some detail. Vedic rishis as seers of the mantra were also Raj yogis. And we see that figures like Vasishta, Vishwamitra, Vamadeva of the Rig Veda have been honored throughout all the text and made teachers at all the levels.
Okay, thank you. The next question, again, this is coming from chat, is that if Indians or Aryans didn't come from outside and uproot the quote-unquote Dravidians, then where did we come from? May you please elaborate on the out of India theory?
Yes, if we look at the not only the archaeological record, we also look at the record of the skeletal record and populations. India has one of the oldest populations of peoples in the world, continually moving through the ice ages. Sometimes it's regarded that the populations or the people moved out of Africa and to a great extent in India and then also through there. So India has never had any problem in producing populations, and Indian populations have been moving out. We can even see in modern or medieval times the gypsies. And in other times, that has also been going on. We also have trade like the Silk Trail and the Spice Trail. So there is this idea of India as a center of civilization. And this is what the Europeans thought all the way up until the 18th century. Nobody looked at India in ancient times as having gotten its civilization from the outside. When the Greeks came to India under Alexander, they found a tradition of, under Megasthenes, of 153 kings going back 6,400 years, according to Greek records. The Greeks never said they brought civilization to India. Only the modern 19th to 20th century Western votaries of the Greeks have done that. The Greeks, in many ways, had a civilization similar to India, as did the Romans. We definitely have the spread of language. In fact, if you can, there's a very interesting interlap. You can do you can put the languages, the Sanskritic or the Indo-European languages as coloring one part of the world. And then you can put the Dharmic traditions as coloring another part of the world. And you see they cover most of the world and they center in India. And yet ancient European pagan traditions also had very similar symbolisms and connections. We note that there was a free trade and connection from North India to the Danube. The Scythians of 2,000 years ago had kingdoms from the Punjab all the way to the Danube, and there was a free flow of trade. Europe is not a continent. Europe is a division of the Asian continent, and the Pontic Steppes has always had a free movement of Indian and particularly Iranian people across that. We have influences into the West. There were trading communities of Indians in Alexandria. Romans, Greeks went to India, great European and particularly Greek philosophers. I believe it was Plotinus and Apollonius went to India. There's a story of Jesus going to India. So there is India as a cradle or source of civilization. And a lot of the arguments that are used for connecting Indo-European languages or connecting the European pagan and Vedic and Iranian traditions work better for an out of India tradition. Historically, we see people mainly moving from east to west into Europe and Central Asia, not west to east the other way. So there is this other theory, the out of India theory, how the Indian culture and languages have spread. And whenever you have an influence, you need a vast civilization. Latin was able to create all these languages that we have in the Romance field of languages. Languages are based upon dominant languages. There's the spread of English, for example. If we go back in ancient times, there is one language that had the influence and the power to create an imprint of Indo-European languages, which is Sanskrit. Other Indo-European lingua francas like Persian or Greek or Latin or even the Scythian or the Prakrits were also doing that as well. So we can actually turn a lot of these arguments in favor of the Indic and Dharmic Vedic culture. And it makes more sense with the archaeological ruins in India. Harappan sites extend to Central Asia, the vast movement of culture, ideas, and peoples that's always been attributed to India. So that is an important theory to study. Konrad Els has also done very good work on that theory.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vamdev ji. I am doing a quick time check and we are at the top of the hour. What I would request is that I will send all questions that have come in from chat to you, Vamdev ji, and I would also encourage people to use Twitter to send and post their questions, marking you on their tweets. I will, as I said, put a sound and a video recording of this webinar as well as update it on Twitter once it's available. So on behalf of Swarajya Magazine and the Indic Academy, I would like to extend again a heartfelt thank you and our appreciation to you for having taken this time out to do this webinar. And thank you everyone for taking the time out on a Sunday evening to dial in and listen in on to this webinar. Thank you again.
And thank you for this wonderful webinar and addressing these very, very important ideas, not only for India, but for all humanity. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.
Thank you. Namaste and pranam, Vamdev ji.